Good morning. Glad to see each of you here. Glad you found your way. I appreciate you showing up this morning. I know there's just so much happening today, and we probably have at least 25 guys doing the work of 5 men out there, so that's cool. But it will be enjoyable, and we look forward to it every year, and glad that you found your way here this morning with us. Many years ago, I worked a lot with youth and had worked in a summer camp and was there in the middle of the week of one when I kind of ran into an astonishing situation, and it had started early. The students were showing up on Sunday afternoon toward the evening, got to be about Wednesday, but one of the people that showed up was a young man I'd never met before. His name was Michael. And Michael was a guy that lived in the area where this very remote little camp was out in western Nebraska. I didn't know him, hadn't seen him before because he hadn't been there at any of the other camps. So I asked the director of the camp about Michael. I said, he's a nice enough guy. Tell me a little bit about him. Came from a very, very rough and difficult situation. His mother Michael and his brother were part of a single parent family that had a lot of struggles. There was a lot of things going on there, including the fact that because of the abuse Michael had experienced, his older brother was gone from the home. Various other things were taking place. And I recognized in him what I had seen in working for many years in human services, is that there was a learning disability. And in the back and forth, I found out he was 21. In a local high school, he was still a senior. And if you know anything about human services, they age out at 21, and then they go into human services for adults. Nevertheless, I had really thought I had prepared super well for that week of study with those kids. I was the main speaker, and then I taught 2 classes during the day as well. And so if you fall asleep now, imagine them back then, right? And so I thought, well, this is good. This is good, some depth and discussion and learning. Some theological things we were struggling with or walking back and forth. On Wednesday, the kids decided that they were going to have a little bit of a testimony time. And so I thought, well, that's fine. So it became open mic, which is always dangerous, but especially in youth camps. So Michael goes to stand up. A couple of the kids had shared a little bit about their faith, what Christ had done for them. He stands up and grabs the microphone. And he says this about as loudly as he could. I'm going to spare your ears. But he says, "Let's talk about Jesus." And all of those kids started cheering. All of those kids just were right there behind him in full support of what he was going to say. And I went, that you're cheering for. But I bring you this depth of study, and you're cheering for this instead. And so I did learn a great deal, and I appreciated Michael through the rest of the week. And he was loved by the other kids that were there. There was a really good group of kids. Really felt at home, engaged a lot. It was awesome to see how loving they really were. And I did learn a great deal during that time. And I will tell you that there's a tendency for me when we're having a special Sunday. So our 5th Sundays are those times in which we invite people in. So watch your calendar and mark it. We usually have a meal afterwards. The intent is bring friends, bring family, just to kind of fellowship together. And so if I was to preach to you today the passage that would have fallen in line with what I'm doing in the book of Matthew today, there's a lot of you who would be going, oh my goodness. If you're interested in what I mean, you can come back next week. But let me just put it this way to you. Let's talk about Jesus. Let's talk about Jesus. Wow, it worked for him. Okay? Really, this morning, no. That was so meaningless. But thank you. Honestly, this is really what I want to do. I want to talk about the Lord because I think that we sometimes get caught up and we can lose track of really what this is all about and what we're all about. So I do want to talk about this. There's so many ideas of who Jesus is, so many versions of Jesus. In fact, if somebody says, hey, I'll talk about Jesus to you, you never know what version of Jesus you're going to get anymore. There's just so many of them out there. Some of those include the ideas that we would see in some faith systems. One includes that they believe that Jesus was Michael the archangel who became Jesus Christ. That's who he was. Others who believe Jesus is created like us, but he's also created like his brother Lucifer. And that Jesus was married and had many wives and children. There's also others, like Islam, which believes Jesus was just a mortal, that Allah, their false god, favored, but was not God's son. Hinduism believes Jesus was one of millions of gods. The Jewish Talmud, which is the writing of how they would practice and what they believe and understand, says Jesus was executed because he practiced sorcery. Interesting. So they considered him to be somebody who practiced sorcery. Fascinating. So is he? Who is Jesus? Well, it's fascinating to me that back in the 70s, when the hymn we just sang, which is really one of those old hymns, was copyrighted in 1971. There's a lot older hymns than that. Anyway, back in that time, there was a lot of things that were coming out. Rock operas, various other things that would designate Jesus in a certain way, display him in a certain way. Those were really strange and odd. Today, the question still remains, who is Jesus? Today, we could have the Jesus variety show in so many ways. And I think in some ways we do see that. That what we see sometimes are short skits or entertaining snippets that kind of keep us involved. For a variety show, for some of you need to learn what that is. It's kind of like putting all sorts of little, YouTube things. Am I still with anybody here? I'm trying to connect with the younger group, but it's like putting several of those together, but they're none of them over 5 minutes long, right? And then you have it together. That's a variety show. For the rest of you, Carol Burnett. And so we know that's what it is, but there seems to be some variety like that. It seems to be stuff is out there. Big conclusions about who Jesus is are drawn from productions that are giving you just a little bit of who he really is. Big conclusions drawn from a little bit of information is a problem. So what? Tom, come on. So what? Well, if you miss the truth of who Jesus truly is, you have missed the point and may, in fact, not be as enthralled with who he is as you ought to be. In today's passage, we enter into the conversation between Jesus and his disciples that speaks to this very topic. In fact, like his first disciples, we too must decide, who is Jesus? Who is he? Looking at the passage today, let's just join in the discussion, and that's what we're going to do as we begin with the setting here in verse 13. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he was asking his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? Well, we hear about this. What is Caesarea Philippi? Caesarea Philippi was an area that included a city, but it was an area northeast of Judea, outside of the center of Jewish faith and practice. So it wasn't any longer in the Jewish realm. It was outside of where most of the Jewish people were around, and into what would be known as pagan territory. The city that was there had a temple that was built by Herod. And it's kind of discussed which Herod made it, because there's more than one in the Bible, but that's not interesting to you. But Herod was the false king of the Jews. Bear that in mind. This temple was dedicated to Caesar, the Roman emperor. The citizens of that city were required to go to that temple at least once a year, take a pinch of incense, and put it on a burning altar, and proclaim this: Caesar is Lord. That's where they are. Jesus has his disciples in that area. Pagan worship was common there. Some of you may not know, but the god Pan was part of that situation, and we're kind of thinking of him more as like Peter Pan or whatever and all those things. Now, this was a very despicable god. The idea of the gates of hell also, which we won't get into today, but the gates of hell were in that same area. People understood this is the gates of Hades. And it was in the same area. So we're in Caesarea Philippi with his disciples. Jesus has gone up in that direction, and then he asks the question, who do people say that the Son of Man is? This is a question about who do people say I am. So in other translations, he even uses it that way. Son of Man is a messianic title, meaning this. Who is it that people say the King of the Jews is? Who is Messiah? Jesus' disciples understood that Jesus had already used this term, Son of Man, to refer to himself many times. So they didn't need the explanation that we might need as we just look at this text by its own. It is the question of opinion here. Who do people say that I am? You know, today there's such a variety in the answer to that question that we'll get to the first century Jewish version of that answer. Will kind of help us look into it. Now, there's a lot of different answers now, but the first century Jewish version is found in verse 14, and they said, some say John the Baptist. Remember the story about John the Baptist? He was an odd cat, right? John the Baptist wore rough clothing. He was emphasizing maybe the person of Elijah. We don't know. I mean, there's so many things, said a lot of things. So why were the people thinking John the Baptist? Because John was an odd and strange holy man. And Jesus, as he walked, came off odd and strange, I'm sure. But in addition to that, their preaching was very similar. In fact, both of them preached the same thing. John and Jesus both said, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Both of them said the same thing. So it's possible that's why people concluded that. The next one is Elijah. Oh, Elijah. Well, if you understand who Elijah was, he was the miracle-working prophet. He did many miraculous things. So people are seeing Jesus performing miracles as he's going through his ministry, and they're saying it's Elijah. And of course, remember that Elijah did not see death. He was taken up. He was translated. He did not die. And so the idea that maybe Elijah has returned was in their minds. The next one, still others, it says, and some other people think Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Well, why Jeremiah? If you've labored through the 50-some-odd chapters of reading the book of Jeremiah, there's a lot that's going on there. Mostly it's sorrow, because he sees the destruction of Jerusalem, and it takes place. And so he writes the book of Lamentations then, following that destruction, and it's very informative. Good read. Why Jeremiah? Actually, the Jewish people had a set of false writings that some of them read, but they would read a lot into it. From those false writings, there was declared that Jeremiah would return before the Messiah would come, bringing the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant and the Ark of the Incense. He would bring all of those things because he had hid them in Mount Nebo before he died. And you thought modern false teachings were crazy. That's pretty unusual, isn't it? But in all of these opinions, every one of them has the same thing. They're speaking of exceptional people. They're speaking of exceptional people. John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, the prophets. It's not just, well, they're just some normal cat. So they understood there was something exceptional about Jesus, but what they misunderstood is that he wasn't an exceptional human. He was much more than that. So we look then in the new question, verse 15. Jesus said to them, but who do you say that I am? Here lies the rub, the important question all individuals have to confront. Who do you say that I am? The answer to this question makes all the difference in our lives and eternity. Who do you say that Jesus is? In fact, I would suggest to you that for every individual you ever meet, what they do with Jesus Christ, in faith or not faith, has eternal consequences. And so this is very important for all of us to look at. Now, wouldn't it be great to have the right answer? We do. Don't you love this? I love the blessed answer. Verse 16, Simon Peter, who usually shot his mouth off at bad times, say things that he would regret. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Wow, what a confession. I was studying in Omaha, Nebraska, through the book of Matthew, and the man that was teaching this class was Dr. James Ekman, who later became the president of that school, and he was just really a great guy. I really appreciated him in so many ways. And he was reading from the 1977 version of the New American Standard Version, which had the old King James way of speaking. in it, and he was dramatic when he would teach this passage. He's coming to this passage, and I mean, we're all sitting there, and I sat fairly close, like row 2. Yes, if you've ever been in those, classes where adults are in there, I was one of those obnoxious people sat up front while y'all were sleeping in the back if you were young, right? And so I sat up front, and he said, and Dr. Ekman had an interesting way of speaking. So he gets to this place, and Simon Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ. Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." And he stood there silent, and he goes, "What does that teach you? What does that tell you?" He had his marker in his hand, and I went, "That Peter spoke in King James Version?" Man, I can't get nothing out of y'all today. You know what he did? The class started laughing, right? That's the only reason I was there. The class started laughing, and he takes that and goes, whoom, and threw his marker at me. Without much effort, I raised my arm and caught the marker in midair. Yes, it was my moment. But what's being said here? You are the Son of the living God. You are the Christ. So the things that Peter is saying are important to us. First of all, he puts it in an emphatic form. So it's not just you are, but it's this idea, you, Jesus, you alone. It's emphatic, are the Christ. Now, the term Christ is anointed one. It has to do, and it is the Greek version of what we'd understand as Messiah. You are the Christ. There is no other Christ. There's not a variance in who he is. There's only one, and it's Jesus. So when Peter answers this way, there's just this no room for opinion. We throw opinion around as if it's factual, don't we? That's our culture. Here's my opinion, and it's fact. No, it's not. It's opinion. That's what politicians get away with, by the way, all the time. Here's my opinion as a fact. That's not a fact. That's an opinion. They differ. Listen, the next thing he says, you are the Christ, the Messiah, the King, the Son of the living God. Once again, in emphatic form, you and you alone are the Son of the living God. This is huge. This is incredible to think because there's so many things that what Peter is saying in this word is, you are the unique person. You are more than just an exceptional person like Elijah. You are the Son of the living God. This is a title that Jesus Christ alone has taken and would confess himself to be. When we start understanding that, I think it helps us because the false views of Jesus portrayed in our modern world almost always take the deity of Christ out of the equation, at least decrease it some. In fact, most are fine with this kind of version of Jesus that's an exceptional person. But the problem is, when it comes to confront them with the fact that he is God, there's your problem. There's the struggle. Too many productions make him more human, even portraying him as a bumbling person or somebody who was beset with every failing that we have. Stop. It's not so. He was without sin. What we refer to as failings are frankly oftentimes sin. Jesus had none. Never committed sin. Listen, Jesus is a good guy that gets us or is no different than us, and that's just not true. He's so completely other while still understanding what it means to be human. I know that's hard to grasp. I mean, when you think you got a hold of it, it slides out like Jell-O on Teflon, right? I mean, it just moves. You can't hang on. Friend, I understand the depth of that, but I want you to understand this. No one else can be described as John, one of his disciples would describe him in the book of John, beginning in verse 1, chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him. He made it all. And apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life. And the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. there came a man sent from God whose name was John, talking about John the Baptist here. He came as a witness to testify about the light so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. There was the true light, Jesus himself, which coming into the world enlightens every man. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He's Elijah. He's John the Baptist. He's Jeremiah. He's a prophet. He's a good guy. He came to his own, Jewish people, and those who were his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name. To receive is to believe. Finally, they were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but born of God. In verse 14, the Word, eternal God, became flesh and dwelt among us. And we saw his glory, John says. Glory is of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. That's the confession. That's who Jesus Christ is. So we must be a people then who understand whatever production, whatever issue, whatever image we may see cast of Jesus Christ, the truth lies in God's word, who he is. This is who he is. He's not just Son of Man, he's Son of God. He's God in flesh, who dwelt among us, who suffered and died for our salvation, took on the sins that we could never atone for. He atoned for. He covered them. How many? We studied in class this morning. All of them. Well, if he was less than God, I would question that. But because he is who he says he is, my dear friend, that's amazing, isn't it? This is God's declaration. Paul would write in the book of Romans chapter 5 and verse 8 that God demonstrates, shows us his love for us, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So as fresh as the moment that I came to salvation and faith in Jesus Christ years and years ago, and as fresh for you too if you've done that, is this moment. Is this moment that my Christ has died for me, because I still struggle with sin issue. Maybe some of you have arrived. You're fooling yourself. That's a song that came to mind. Anyway, be aware. This is the God that we're dealing with. This is the Christ. I want you to understand the question before you is the question of all time. Who do you say that Jesus is? There's a blessed response. He is the Christ, the Son of the living God. This then becomes the foundation for salvation for eternity. It requires a personal response, your response. Let's walk through it. Book of Romans. There we go. Romans 10, 9 through 13. That if you confess with your mouth Jesus as Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Explains itself. For with the heart a person believes, resulting in righteousness. See, through faith, through believing, you receive Christ's righteousness. His goodness is yours. And with the mouth he confesses, resulting in salvation. Jesus is Lord. For the scriptures say, whoever believes in him will not be disappointed. If you've been walking it out for a long time, struggling a little bit, let this one firm you up, friend. Let this one firm you. You will not be disappointed. I know the disappointments that are out there in the world, because everything of the world will disappoint you, ultimately. He will not disappoint you. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, abounding in riches for all who call on him. For whoever will call on the name of the Lord will be saved. Wow, that's awesome, isn't it? And do you know how many weird people are going to be those that call upon the name of the Lord when we get to heaven? Just look around. Or none of you were looking anywhere else, but I qualify, okay. Listen, isn't that wonderful? That is Jesus. This is Jesus, who is the Christ, the Son of the living God. You know, I know for those who believe that Jesus is the Christ, Son of the living God, this is the beginning of our life in him. the salvation point. We lean into the Scriptures and to learn more about Him, to be enthralled with who He is. You see, from Genesis on, He's spoken of. In Genesis, even as the sin had fallen down, the speaking God, and He was judging, said, the seed of Eve, not multiple, one, will attack the seed of the devil, will defeat him. We know who that is. That's Christ. As we pass on through the Old Testament, looking to everything else, all of this sacrificial systems, all of these festivals, everything else was pointing to Jesus Christ. He is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. That's who He is. And He's coming again. And He's establishing His forever, ever kingdom, which will be perfect. And you and I will also be there through faith in Him alone. What? Yes. So that we too will be made perfect, so that we will enjoy perfection for an eternity to come. I think sometimes as believers, especially as pastors, we can struggle with remaining enthralled about who Jesus is. So I sometimes must be refreshed, must be reminded over and over again about how incredible He truly is. And in that process, I find it interesting that maybe there's those who weren't even believing people that were enthralled by Him, at least at one point in time. And friend, I want to share that with you. There was an interview that took place, and the interviewer asked this question. He says, to what extent were you influenced by Christianity? The answer says, as a child, I received instruction both in the Bible and in the Talmud. I'm a Jew, but I'm enthralled by the luminous figure of the Nazarene, Jesus. Question, you accept the historical existence of Jesus Christ? The answer, unquestionably, no one can read the Gospels without feeling the actual presence of Jesus. His personality pulsates in every word. No myth is filled with such life. The person being interviewed, Albert Einstein, 1929. Let's remind one another. Let's remind one another as believers of the great one who gave His life for us and is indeed the Christ. Let's remind one another of the truth, of what He's come to do, what He came and accomplished, and maybe we can sing about this in a way that will encourage one another. I would ask you just to rise, but I'd also ask you, if you have never received Jesus Christ as Lord, to simply ask Him to forgive your sins, to enter your life and lean on Him and grow in Him to understand just how awesome He truly is. Please join us.